Good to go. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Before highlighting priorities for this week, I want to address the unprecedented attack on Israel this past weekend by Iran and its proxies. Treasury will not hesitate to work with our allies to use our sanctions authority to continue disrupting the Iranian regime's malign and destabilizing activity. Let me now turn to the global economic outlook, which remains resilient. Global growth has consistently exceeded the predictions of many forecasters, and the IMF projects it will continue at 3.2% this year and 3.1% next year. Global economic performance has in part been powered by a strong U.S. economy. While even 1 year ago, many forecasted much weaker U.S. economic performance, U.S. GDP growth is strong, and expectations have been revised upward since January. The labor market is also remarkably healthy. Inflation has come down significantly since its peak, though we have more work to do. We're also focused on building on our historically fast and inclusive recovery by investing for the medium and long term, including through President Biden's Investing in America agenda. We, of course, recognize that the recovery has been uneven across and within many countries, and that there remain risks to the global outlook. And from the start of the administration, President Biden has made clear that American isolationism was over. So while we expect that America's economic strength will continue to underpin global growth, we've also been engaging with the world to mitigate short-term risks and support sustainable long-term growth, and will continue doing so this week. As Treasury Secretary, I've focused on deepening economic ties with both our long-standing allies and partners and emerging markets. President Biden and I believe that promoting peace and prosperity abroad leads to stronger markets that can benefit American workers and firms through trade and investment. And deepening ties helps us build resilient supply chains, an approach I've called friendshoring, which bolsters our nation's economic security and brings benefits to other economies. This week, I'll meet with South Korea and Japan for the first trilateral finance ministers meeting to coordinate on issues from sanctions to climate and financial resilience in the Pacific Islands. I'll participate in a trilateral principal-level exercise with the United Kingdom and the European Banking Union to help fortify our systems for rapid coordination and communication during times of financial stress. And I'll continue working with Brazil on priorities for its G20 presidency, as we worked with India last year and will work with South Africa next year. I'll also remain focused on our relationship with China. While in China last week, I emphasized that a healthy U.S.-China economic relationship with a level playing field can bring significant benefits for American firms and workers. And I raised concerns the United States shares with many other countries about overcapacity, which poses risks to America and to the global economy. The U.S. and China also announced that we're increasing cooperation in our shared work against money laundering, engaging in exchanges on balanced growth in the domestic and global economies, and expanding ongoing technical exchanges on financial regulation and financial stability. We'll sustain momentum this week by holding in person the fourth meetings of the Economic and Financial Working Groups, which allow us to share information, identify potential areas of cooperation, and when we disagree, frankly communicate concerns. These meetings will include important discussions on anti-money laundering and balanced growth. Alongside bilateral engagements, we're focused this week on continuing our efforts to strengthen the international financial architecture. Heightened vulnerabilities from challenges including climate change, pandemics, and fragility and conflict pose risks to global growth and development. No one country can tackle these issues alone, nor is bilateral action sufficient, so we've pushed for decisive and coordinated action. Since I called for MDB evolution, World Bank President Ajay Banga and leaders across the MDB system have enabled significant progress toward building better, bigger, and more effective MDBs that help uphold the rules-based international order and are positioned to drive tangible impact. We've generated nearly $250 billion in new lending capacity over the next decade, $200 billion from responsibly stretching balance sheets and pursuing innovative measures, and almost $50 billion from capital increases we successfully negotiated at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the Inter-American Development Bank. Looking ahead, we hope to agree on a callable capital increase for the African Development Bank next month, and we're focused on achieving a robust IDA replenishment that provides crucial resources to the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries, as well as ongoing work to incentivize projects with cross-border impacts, mobilize private capital, and bolster climate financing. The MDBs invested nearly $100 billion in climate finance in 2022, of which $60 billion went to low and middle income countries. We're now working with Brazil to facilitate increased access to climate finance through a review of the climate finance architecture. We're also urging the MDBs to increase their focus on fragility and conflict, which can reverse hard-won development gains, undermine the impact of new investments, and have far-ranging spillover effects, such as increasing food insecurity. We see current challenges in Haiti, Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere, and know more needs to be done, as I'll discuss this week with President Banga and leaders from IDA countries facing these challenges directly. At the IMF, we're focused on further strengthening the institution's ability to serve at the center of the global financial safety net and play a crucial crisis response function. The US and other countries achieved a landmark 50% increase in IMF quota resources. At home, Congress authorized $21 billion in lending to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is key to enabling low-income countries to restore macroeconomic stability and address debt sustainability risks, and extended our participation in the IMF's new arrangements to borrow through 2030, helping shore up a critical second line of defense in the IMF's resources. As we head into managing director Kristalina Georgieva's second term, we'll push for strong IMF programs that incorporate robust policy conditionality to enable countries to restore stability and exit from IMF lending, and we'll see greater collaboration across the IMF and MDBs. We also continue to urge progress in particular debt restructuring cases, as we've achieved in Zambia, and to advance general reforms through the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which will meet this week. Many countries that are solvent are also facing increasing challenges. In 2022, net inflows to developing countries dropped to their lowest level since 2009. This means too much money flowing out in the form of debt service relative to how much money is flowing in. We need to examine debt service where it's a binding constraint on necessary investments related to climate and development, channel even more resources to countries making reforms, and deploy all our tools in a coordinated way to support these countries in making key investments. Finally, we've focused this week on advancing our work to protect human lives and the global economy in the context of ongoing conflicts. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues in its third year, we remain committed to standing as part of a global coalition to support Ukraine and constrict Russia's ability to wage its brutal war. This is a humanitarian and moral imperative, and also an economic one given the war's significant negative impacts on economies around the world. I'm glad that the IMF recently affirmed Ukraine's strong performance on its program and is providing financing and expertise to support economic growth and a robust reform agenda. And I urge the House of Representatives to provide critical support for our allies, including Ukraine. We announced additional sanctions on Russia's national payment card system and on Russian regional financial institutions in February, and we're continuing to work with our international partners to unlock the economic value of immobilized Russian sovereign assets and ensure that Russia pays for the damage it's caused. We're also responding to challenges in the Middle East. The attack by Iran and its proxies underscores the importance of Treasury's work to use our economic tools to counter Iran's malign activity. We've targeted over 500 individuals and entities connected to terrorism and terrorist financing by the Iranian regime and its proxies since the start of the administration, including targeting Iran's drone and missile programs and its financing of Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militia groups. From this weekend's attacks to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, Iran's actions threaten the region's stability and could cause economic spillovers. As we continue to use economic tools, including against Hamas, we've emphasized Treasury's humanitarian-related authorizations to ensure sanctions do not impede life-saving aid. In Gaza, the entire population, over 2 million people, face acute food insecurity, and most of the population has been displaced. It's incumbent on all of us here at these meetings to do everything in our power to end this suffering. Finally, to support stability in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel, and the broader Middle East region, we're targeting perpetrators of extremist settler violence in the West Bank, working to ensure a functioning banking system there, and supporting the IMF programs in Jordan and Egypt. Let me stop there, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
First question will go to Victoria Bloomberg.
Thank you. Secretary, I had a couple of questions on the situation in the Middle East. First, on the economy, how concerned are you about the impact this escalation can have on oil markets and the global economy more broadly? Are you seeing spillovers? Do you expect to see spillovers? And then secondly, you mentioned using the Treasury sanctions authority. Is this a warning in case of further escalation, or is this something you're actively looking at in response to the recent attacks? Thank you.
Well, in terms of spillovers, we have seen some spillovers, but I would not describe them as widespread. Of course, we are working hard and feel strongly that we want to contain the conflict so that it doesn't become a broader regional or even global conflict. But the spillovers, some countries in the Middle East have seen negative impacts on their economies. With respect to sanctions, I fully expect that we will take additional sanctions action against Iran in the coming days. We don't preview our sanctions tools, but in discussions I've had, all options to disrupt terrorist financing of Iran continue to be on the table. As I mentioned, since the start of the administration, our sanctions have targeted over 500 individuals and entities connected to terrorism and terrorist financing. And since October 7th, in addition to robust Hamas sanctions, we've also acted against 117 people, entities, and vessels tied to financing of Iran's destabilizing activities, and we have acted against UAV and ballistic missile procurement networks, assassination rings, and terrorist networks. So I fully expect we will take additional sanctions action.
Next question goes to Andrea with Reuters.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me just follow up on Victoria's question there. So on the sanctions, just a year ago, you told Congress that you thought the sanctions had not been particularly effective in changing Iran's behavior. And I wonder if you are looking now at other instruments that you could use to pressure Iran not to repeat the unprecedented attack on Israel. And specifically in that regard, is there some way that you could affect its ability to benefit from oil exports? And would that be a big consideration? They produce 3% of the world's oil. Then secondly, on the Russian sovereign asset question, the G7 finance ministers will be meeting. Are you seeing any progress in terms of convincing other G7 allies that there is a legitimate and legal basis to seize Russian assets? Can you walk us through what the current state of play is? Thank you.
Sure. In terms of the first question on ways to discourage Iran's behavior, Treasury plays an important role when it comes to sanctions. State Department is involved as well. But of course, there's a much broader diplomatic initiative that my colleagues in the administration and President Biden are involved in that are intended to use a variety of diplomatic tools to induce Iran to constrain its destabilizing behavior. With respect to oil, we have been working to diminish Iran's ability to export oil. Clearly, Iran is continuing to export some oil. There may be more that we could do. I don't want to preview our actual sanctions activities, but certainly that remains in focus as a possible area that we could address. You asked about Russian sovereign assets. So let me emphasize that we absolutely are committed to Ukraine's support against the brutal Russian invasion. There's utterly no substitute for Congress acting to provide both military and direct budget support, and I'm very hopeful that Congress will make progress on that. there's really no substitute for that. But I do fear that Russia is beginning to see signs that the U.S. and our allies are tiring and finding it more difficult to find ways to support Ukraine, and that gives them the hope that they can outlast us and wait for our resolve to crumble. And Ukraine needs more support and an ongoing stream of support. And that makes us focused on finding a way to unlock economic value and a stream of resources from the Russian sovereign assets. About $285 billion that's been immobilized. And the G7 leaders asked us to present a series of options to them at their June summit. And we're working, I've had many conversations. I expect to have further conversations. We have a G7 meeting tomorrow. I have a number of bilats, and I expect to continue these discussions. We're looking at a series of possibilities, ranging from actually seizing the assets to using them as collateral. Importantly, the European Union has already acted to segregate the interest income from immobilized Russian assets at Euroclear, and these are really not the property of Russia, and they're moving forward to use these assets for Ukraine. So we're very supportive of that, and we'll look for additional ways of unlocking value from those assets.
Next question will go to Alan with the New York Times.
Thanks, Secretary Yellen. On China and the conversations today, and I followed from last week, the World Economic Outlook from the IMF today warned that tariffs are a downside risk for the global economy and warned about geopolitical fragmentation. You've previously said that tariffs are taxes on consumers. Can you give us the economic argument for why tariffs might be an appropriate remedy to deal with Chinese excess industrial capacity?
So first of all, let me say trade has been an important source of growth for the United States economy. But some of the scenarios the IMF has looked at, I believe, vastly overstate the economic impact on what's happening now in terms of Chinese overcapacity and attempts to deal with it. First of all, we've said repeatedly that we believe that trade and investment, robust trade and investment with China is beneficial. It is not something we're trying to diminish. Most of it is uncontroversial, and we're looking to preserve it. And we have a deep and robust trade relationship with China, in spite of the fact that there are particular sectors that China is targeting for expansion that we think pose threats to the United States, to employment, to our growth prospects, and can negatively impact firms and workers. We do believe that over-reliance on any single country, and we think we saw concrete evidence of this during the pandemic, pose risks. And I would say the IMF analysis, while they focus on the downside of actions to address this problem, really don't focus very much on the problem itself and the costs that can come from over-reliance on a single country. In the area of clean energy products, where we're very concerned about overcapacity, we are highly reliant, the entire globe is, on China they are the dominant source of supply in a number of areas, including batteries, solar panels, and the like. And, in my meetings with my Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He, we have agreed that we want to see robust trade and investment, but on a level playing field. And in the areas that I've been discussing where there's overcapacity, what particularly concerns us is that there is not a level playing field. There are massive industrial support going to certain advanced manufacturing sectors in China that are capacity utilization, and I believe there was even a report this morning on China's growth that showed overall capacity utilization has declined. There's been a surge in investment in manufacturing, and in these sectors, capacity utilization is very low. With these subsidies, the amount of capacity exceeds global demand and what it's likely to be even over the next decade. And so this isn't a level playing field, and when the market's weak and prices fall, it's our firms that go out of business, those in our allied countries. Chinese firms continue to receive support so that they remain in. So this isn't a level playing field, and from a supply chain standpoint, I think it creates risks that we're clearly seeking to mitigate, and it's also unfair to our workers and firms.
Next question will go to Andy Doran, the Wall Street Journal.
Hi, Secretary Yellen. You mentioned that you'll be meeting with your Japanese counterpart, and you mentioned your friend-shoring agenda. I wanted to ask about Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel. The president has said that U.S. Steel should remain domestically owned. Do you agree with that? Should U.S. Steel remain domestically owned? And is that statement a sign that CFIUS will block this transaction?
Well, on CFIUS, I cannot say anything about even what cases are under review at CFIUS. There is utter confidentiality that applies to that. I certainly accept the president's view, which he has stated, that the company should remain in American hands. He hasn't said specifically that it's an issue of national security, but one that has to do with the good of the workers in the country.
Final question will go to Julie with AFP.
Oh, sorry. It's better with the microphone. Julie Chabanas, AFP. Just a follow-up on the Russian assets. Russia has threatened of sanctions in case their frozen assets are used.
To sanction whom?
Russia has threatened to sanction EU, especially. What could be the consequences of such sanctions?
Russia has already taken actions against firms based in the United States and Europe and other countries. Of course, there could be retaliation, and we are looking at the risks that are associated with using these assets and evaluating different strategies that we might present to the G7 leaders. Evaluating the risks is part of that. But overall, I believe there are ways of managing the risks, particularly if the G7 acts together in unison, and that it's important for us to do so. We've indicated that the G7 has that the assets will remain immobilized until Russia has paid for the damage that it's done to Ukraine. And I would point out that since most of the assets are no longer invested, they're in cash and no longer earning interest, that it's quite clear that those interest proceeds do not belong to Russia and provide a source that could be used that should, not be an issue from Russia's point of view.
All right, thank you all for joining us. Thanks.
So there is a fentanyl